The morning haze still clung to the ridgeline when the rotor crews of HMLA-169 stepped onto the tarmac. Blades from an idling AH-1Z Viper carved the air into thin white ribbons, scattering sand across the concrete. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but the desert heat already pressed against the skin like a second uniform. At the far end of the line, standing slightly apart from the Marines in their crisp flight deck gear, was Adrian Cole, a volunteer mechanic, technically a civilian ambiguously stationed and frequently considered a walking anomaly in a place that disliked anomalies. He didn't belong here. Everyone knew it. But the Corps also quietly knew something else. Adrian could hear machines. Not metaphorically, not romantically. He listened to them the way a musician listened to strings, which was why, even though he wasn't enlisted, he had been allowed to work under supervision on non-critical systems, cleaning housings, checking wiring, polishing components. Nothing more. Definitely nothing involving fire control. Yet today that boundary would shift, and the consequences would echo far beyond a desert training range. Adrian squinted through the shimmering heat as the new arrival rolled toward him on a maintenance cart, a prototype XM301 Gatling gun meant for integration tests on the Viper. Sleek, compact, almost predatory in its geometry, like a piece of future hardware smuggled from a decade ahead. Chief Ordnance Officer Ramirez walked beside it, grumbling. "I swear if Command gives us one more last-minute test without a manual—" "You'd complain anyway," said another Marine. Ramirez stopped in front of Adrian. "Cole, you're here early." Adrian shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Machines talking again. "A little." Ramirez exhaled. "Fine. You can observe, but don't touch anything. This is a prototype. If it looks wrong, smells wrong, or even dreams wrong, stay away." Adrian nodded, though he already felt that tug in his chest, that quiet, familiar hum, like a vibration in the bones. The Gatling gun was trying to tell him something, and he didn't yet know the language. Before the integration test began, a convoy rolled into base, 3 Humvees, 1 command truck, and a vehicle with diplomatic plates which immediately caused murmurs among the Marines. Adrian turned just as the back door opened. A tall man stepped out, lean, silver-haired, carrying himself with the wary calm of someone who had survived a world that tried to crush him and somehow failed. His clothing marked him as a liaison officer, not U.S. military, not quite civilian either. His name badge read, Kaito Sakamura. Ramirez muttered, "Great." Another observer. But Adrian froze. He knew the name. Everyone in rotary wing history circles did. Sakamura was a former Japanese self-defense force gunnery technician, famous for surviving an attack during a peacekeeping mission where a misaligned Gatling housing saved his life and cost his team theirs. His life's work had shifted after that non-lethal redesigns, safety protocols, reconciliation projects. Adrian stepped forward. "You're him." Sakamura smiled gently. "That is usually how people begin." "What are you doing here?" Adrian asked. "I was invited," Sakamura replied. "Your program is testing a new rotary cannon. My role is to observe the safety design choices." And maybe his eyes softened to see whether the world has learned to build weapons with more wisdom than we once did. Ramirez, overhearing, cut in. "Fine, but stand back during the procedure." He turned to Adrian. "Cole, don't bother the man." But Sakamura surprised them both. "I would like the volunteer to stand near me," he said. "He watches machines the way I used to. It may help." Adrian blinked. "How do you know?" "Because you were staring at that Gatling gun," Sakamura said the way a man stares at a story he hasn't heard yet. When the integration crew mounted the prototype onto the Viper's port side stub wing, Adrian's heartbeat began to race. He watched the gun's barrels rotate slowly during calibration, listened to the faint clatter inside the housing. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't right either. Like a musician hearing a violin that was tuned to the correct note but the wrong tension. Adrian stepped closer to Ramirez. "Chief, something's off," Cole Ramirez warned. "No, really. The barrel alignment, the firing pulse is dragging. It'll choke at high RPM." Ramirez rolled his eyes. "We're running a dry cycle. Stand back." But Sakamura tilted his head, listening intently. "You hear something he said to Adrian?" Adrian nodded. "What exactly?" "The sync motor isn't matching the feeder. The delay will compound when the rate increases. Ramirez nearly barked. That's impossible. The system's self-balancing. Sakamura leaned toward the gun, eyes narrowing. Unless the balancer is miscalibrated, the prototype specs might differ from the unit we received. The crew fell silent. Ramirez groaned. Fine. We'll check. They checked. Everything looked normal. On paper. But the hum, the tone, the tiny vibration, none of those were on paper. Sakamura folded his arms. Volunteers often see what experts overlook. It is good to listen, Ramirez-san. Ramirez muttered something in Spanish and stepped away. Adrian stared at the housing. Against his better judgment, against orders, against everyone watching. He reached in and made an adjustment, a small one. Barely a twist of a tension screw, a correction to the motor that fed the Gatling's barrels. But it was not procedure. Sakamura's eyes widened. Cole? You, Ramirez shouted. Cole, hands off, too late. Adrian stepped back. A mechanic had just violated a protocol on a prototype gun in front of military observers. Ramirez dragged him away by the collar. That is it. You're done. Off the line. But then, the Gatling gun cycled. Smoothly. Perfectly smoothly. For the first time all morning, even Ramirez paused. Sakamura stepped forward, his voice soft and almost reverent. It is balanced now. Ramirez spun on Adrian, furious and confused. Explain yourself. Adrian swallowed. It just didn't sound right. The timing was off. Timing? Ramirez repeated, exasperated. You timed a Gatling gun by ear. I didn't try to. Adrian whispered. The machine told me. Sakamura studied him for a long moment. That is not delusion, he said quietly. Some men carry a gift. During the war, some mechanics saved hundreds by sensing a malfunction before it happened. Others died because they ignored that instinct. Ramirez pinched the bridge of his nose. If this goes wrong during the test command, we'll have my head. Sakamura answered gently. If he had not adjusted it, you would have begun the test with a misaligned feeder, likely causing a jam at high fire rate. Or worse, an overspin. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Ramirez exhaled. Fine, we proceed. But if this thing explodes, Cole, your ghost is getting court-martialed. The firing range stretched across a desolate plain littered with shredded target silhouettes, twisted metal frames, and scorched earth. A perfect graveyard for bad ideas and the occasional great one. Ramirez radioed the tower. Range hot. Begins spin-up. The Viper's engines growled as the pilot throttled forward. The Gatling gun spun, starting low, then accelerating. Adrian felt his ribs vibrate from the oscillation, but the sound was right, not perfect. Machines were never perfect, but true. Ramirez watched every gauge. Sakamura watched Adrian. And Adrian watched the Gatling gun. When the rate peaked, the pilot received the call. Fire! The barrels flashed, a single ripping burst of kinetic fury, and the target's 5 steel silhouettes did not fall, did not even stagger. They disappeared, shredded so instantly, so violently, that only drifting metallic dust remained. The range officer swore. Ramirez's jaw fell open. Adrian nearly lost his breath. Sakamura whispered, Instantaneous erosion. Remarkable. The radio crackled. Holy, what did you do to that cannon? Ramirez looked at Adrian, dawning horror on his face. Cole, you're wrong adjustment. Sakamura corrected him softly. It was the right adjustment. But the celebration, if it could be called one, lasted exactly 3 minutes. A command officer marched across the tarmac flanked by 2 MPs, expression stiff as cold steel. Who touched the prototype, he demanded. No one spoke. Adrian stepped forward, heart pounding. I did. Ramirez swore under his breath. Cole, don't. But it was too late. The officer turned sharply. You are not authorized personnel. You compromised a controlled weapons test. Sakamura stepped between them. He saved your test. That remains to be seen. The officer ordered the MPs escort him to holding. Temporary detainment. Adrian's blood ran cold. He knew he wasn't a soldier, but being detained on a military base carried consequences. Ramirez stepped forward. Sir, wait. the adjustment. Out of my hands, Chief. Sakamura watched pain flickering in his eyes, an echo of his own past mistakes. As the MPs approached, Adrian lowered his gaze. He had only wanted the machine to be safe, to be right. Now he would pay for it. Sakamura finally spoke. "May I accompany him as an observer?" The officer hesitated. "Fine." And so Adrian Cole, the volunteer who shouldn't have touched the Gatling gun, the man who made it erase targets in an instant, walked toward detainment with the one person who understood why he had acted. Sakamura leaned close as they walked. "Cole-san," he said softly, "do not lose heart. The world often punishes those who prevent disasters it never sees." Adrian wanted to believe that. But the sun was rising hot and angry over the desert range, and the footsteps behind him felt like the closing of a cell door. The test had succeeded. And yet everything felt wrong. He didn't know how part 2 of his story would unfold, but he felt deeply that the Gatling gun wasn't done changing his life, and neither was the man walking beside him. The holding room wasn't a cell in the cinematic sense, no iron bars, no flickering lights, but it carried the same hollow air of unwanted confinement. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead. A metal table stood between 2 chairs. The walls were a sterile off-white meant to calm, but somehow only colder for it. Adrian Cole sat with his hands flat on the table, knuckles pale. He had been through this before, protocol talks, warnings, signed documents, but never under arrest, and never for something he believed had prevented a catastrophic failure. He silently replayed the adjustment in his head. The tension screw, the timing pulse, the feeder drive sync. He knew machines. He knew what they sounded like when they were hurting. So why did doing the right thing feel like stepping into an execution chamber? The door clicked. Sakamura entered, not escorted by MPs this time, but by a quiet, solemn intention, all his own. He carried a folder, not quite thick, not quite thin, and set it gently on the table. "Cole-san," he said softly, "I requested permission to speak with you alone." Adrian forced a breath. "They're going to throw me off base, aren't they?" Sakamura did not smile. "I do not believe so. But they will require explanations. And explanations," he said, taking a seat, "are easier when one understands the story behind the act." Adrian blinked. "The story? Yes." Sakamura folded his hands. "Everything has a story. Machines, soldiers, volunteers, even mistakes, especially mistakes." Adrian rested his elbows on the table. "You said earlier that some men saved lives by sensing malfunctions. You've seen this before." Sakamura nodded once slowly. "It was decades ago. I was a gunnery technician in a joint peacekeeping unit. My team operated a rotary cannon very similar to your Gatling gun. During a routine patrol, I noticed a drag in the rotation cycle. Small, barely audible. But I ignored the instinct." His eyes darkened. "The weapon overheated, jammed, then blew part of its housing. I survived because I stood on the wrong side of the barrel. My team did not." Adrian's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. I have lived with that moment every day," Sakamura said. "Since then I have vowed never to dismiss intuition rooted in experience. Today you acted on such intuition, but the U.S. military must label it a violation before it can label it a contribution." "So I'm stuck in the part before contribution," Adrian muttered. "For now," Sakamura said. "But I would like to help move you to the next part." Adrian frowned. Why, Sakamura reached into the folder and placed a small object on the table. It was a metal calibration tag, half-scorched, the same type used on old Japanese rotary cannons. A number was engraved into it, barely visible after years of abrasion. Adrian touched it. Cold. Heavy. Too damaged to serve a function, now only a symbol. "This belonged to the weapon that malfunctioned," Sakamura said. "It is the only piece that remained intact. I keep it as a reminder machines are mirrors. When they fail, they reflect the flaws of the humans who built or maintained them." He looked directly into Adrian's eyes. "You saw a flaw today. You acted. You did not wait for permission. Had you waited?" He inhaled. "We might be discussing casualties instead of consequences." Adrian swallowed hard. "Then why are they detaining me?" Because Sakamura said with a gentle shrug, "The world is still learning to trust people like you." He slid the calibration tag closer. "Hold on to this, at least until we speak with command. It may help them understand through your story and mine that intuition is not disobedience when it prevents disaster." Adrian closed his fingers around the relic. For a moment it felt like the weight of another lifetime, someone else's tragedy placed in his palm as a bridge rather than a burden. The hearing room was stark functional and filled with the kind of tension that made even the chairs seem nervous. 3 officers sat behind a long table. Ramirez stood beside the projector displaying telemetry from the firing test. Adrian and Sakamura entered together. "Commander Wright." The senior officer didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Cole, you violated protocol on a controlled weapon system. State your justification." Adrian swallowed. "The Gatling gun's timing was off. I heard it. If it had been fired at full RPM without correction, the feeder might have jammed or overspun." "By ear," Wright said flatly. "Yes. Do you have training in advanced rotary cannon physics?" "No, sir." "So you expect us to believe that you, a civilian volunteer, detected an alignment flaw that our engineers and Marines did not?" "I didn't expect anyone to believe anything," Adrian replied. "I listened to the machine." A murmur rippled across the panel, half skepticism, half irritation. But Sakamura stepped forward. "Commander Wright," he said, bowing slightly out of habit, "I would like to speak on this man's behalf." Wright raised an eyebrow. "We invited you to observe, not testify." "I understand," Sakamura said, "but I also understand rotary cannons more intimately than anyone here. And I understand the consequences of ignoring small mechanical instabilities." Wright looked at him for a long moment. "Proceed." Sakamura clicked the projector remote. A new slide appeared, a rotor schematic overlaid with distortion markers. "This," he said, "is the signature of a misaligned feeder drive, only detectable under acceleration. Your sensors did not reach that threshold until full spin-up. The next slide, telemetry from the actual test. Mr. Cole's adjustment corrected the drift by 11%, enough to prevent a jam, enough to prevent a catastrophic overspin." Wright frowned. "How do you know?" "Because," Sakamura said, voice steady, "I have lived the consequence of ignoring an 11% drift." He placed the scorched calibration tag on the table. Ramirez, stiff as a board until now, finally spoke. "Sir, I didn't want to admit it earlier, but Cole was right. The gun was dragging. I ignored it." "He didn't." The other officers exchanged glances. Wright leaned back, digesting the information. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that a civilian volunteer prevented a malfunction that would have compromised the test?" "Yes," Sakamura said, "and that the result, the weapon instantly erasing targets, was due in part to his correction." "Yes." Wright tapped his pen. "Mr. Cole, the United States Marine Corps cannot encourage unauthorized tampering, but neither can it ignore a contribution that may advance this program significantly." Adrian braced himself. Wright continued, "We will not press charges." Ramirez exhaled audibly. But Wright added, "This must not happen again. Any future adjustments must go through an officer and be logged." "Yes, sir," Adrian said quickly. Wright nodded once. "Dismissed. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't vindication, just relief." But relief tasted good. Outside the hearing room, the sun was dipping low, bathing the base in a soft copper glow. The Viper that had fired the test burst was being rolled back into the hangar, still bearing scorch marks from the power of the weapon. Ramirez clapped Adrian on the shoulder. "Kid, you got lucky." Adrian half laughed. "You're telling me." Ramirez nodded grudgingly. "Still, good work." Then he walked off shouting at a junior tech for misplacing a wrench. Adrian stood with Sakamura near the empty range. "I never got to ask," Adrian said. "Back in the hearing, why did you stand up for me?" Sakamura didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the distant mountains as if seeing something decades away. "During my incident," he said softly, "I wished someone had stood up for me. No one did. They blamed me for not following procedure. They were not wrong, but they were not entirely right either. A machine can be perfect on paper and flawed in truth." He turned back to Adrian. "Today I saw the younger version of myself. But you acted where I hesitated. You did not let fear of rank stop you from preventing a failure." Adrian looked at the calibration tag still in his hand. "What will you do now?" he asked. Sakamura smiled faintly. "I must report back to my superiors. But before I leave, I would like to make a request." "A request?" "Yes." Sakamura nodded. "I would like to witness the next test. With you." Adrian blinked. "Me? They'll barely let me near the gun. Then I will request permission," Sakamura said. "Volunteers with intuition are rare, and intuition grows stronger under guidance. Let us learn from each other." Adrian hesitated only a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." 2 days later, under clearer skies and calmer winds, HMLA-169 prepared for another live fire test. This time Adrian stood beside Ramirez, not as a detainee, not as a liability, but as a recognized observer under Sakamura's supervision. Targets were placed farther out. Reinforced metal moving stands, different angles. The test was designed to assess sustained accuracy, not just raw destructive force. Ramirez radioed range hot. "Stand by." Adrian closed his eyes, listening. The Gatling gun spun up. Smooth, steady, balanced. He opened his eyes and nodded. Sakamura whispered, "You hear it again?" "Yes," Adrian said. "This time, it's right from the start." The pilot received the call. Fire. The Gatling unleashed a burst longer, more controlled, sweeping across targets like a laser made of lead. One by one, each target vanished. Not merely damaged, erased. The range officer cackled through the radio. "That's impossible. That's actually impossible." Ramirez glanced at Adrian. "You sure you don't want to enlist?" Adrian laughed. "I think I'm doing enough damage as a volunteer." But Sakamura wasn't laughing. He looked moved, deeply moved. "Cole-san," he said softly. "Do you know what this means?" Adrian shrugged. "That the gun works. That it works because you trusted yourself," Sakamura said. "And because you let others trust you." Adrian didn't know how to answer, so he simply nodded. As the gun cooled, the desert wind carried the warm smell of cordite across the range. Something had changed. In the program, in the weapon systems, in Adrian, and in the bond between a former gunnery technician haunted by the past and a volunteer who refused to let another machine fail. When the test ended, teams began packing equipment. The sky deepened into a purple dusk. Sakamura stood beside Adrian, silent for a long moment. Finally, he took a small cloth pouch from his coat. "This," he said, "is yours now." Adrian opened it. Inside lay the scorched calibration tag, cleaned, polished as much as possible, its engraving restored just enough to read Unit 14S 1997. Adrian whispered, "I can't take this." "You can," Sakamura replied, "because today I saw that the story of this tag no longer belongs to failure. It belongs to restoration. You have rewritten its meaning." He closed Adrian's hand around it. "In my culture, when an object survives tragedy, we say it carries memory. When someone redeems that memory, we return the object to the one who can guide it into a better future." Adrian swallowed hard. "Thank you. I'll take care of it." "I know you will," Sakamura said gently. They shook hands, not as superior and subordinate, not as nations, but as witnesses to each other's humanity. The desert wind moved between them like a quiet acknowledgement. Later that night, as the base quieted, Adrian sat on the hood of an idle Humvee, staring at the tag in his hand. Its edges caught the moonlight, glinting like an old wound that no longer hurt. Sakamura approached one last time before departing in the diplomatic convoy. "Cole-san," he said, "when people watch videos of this test, and they will see a weapon, but I hope they also see a lesson." Adrian looked up. "Which one?" "That sometimes the mistake that breaks the rule is the action that saves the day." They stood together for a final moment. Sakamura bowed. "Until we meet again." The convoy drove off, leaving Adrian alone with the silence of the desert and a future he hadn't expected. He held up the calibration tag, letting it catch the moonlight again, and he spoke aloud, not to anyone present, but to anyone who might hear the story later. "If you were me," he said softly, "would you have made the adjustment?" The wind whispered back, carrying his question into the night. A question for the audience. A question for anyone who ever felt something was wrong and wondered whether they should act.